You have probably at some point heard of the internet referred to as a tool. Endless streams of information are available at your fingertips, and with the advent of smart mobile devices, no one is bound by cords to attain it. If this is all familiar to you, then you're probably also familiar with the foreboding maxim, the internet never forgets. It's not just cringeworthy pictures of a night on the town that lives on in cyberspace. News about people's run-ins with law enforcement, financial ruin, or dumb decisions they made earlier in life. The existence of this information for all to see has brought about the conversation over the right to be forgotten from the internet. To understand what the right to be forgotten is and its place in modern society, we have to take a trip over to the European Union and talk to Molly Quell, Courthouse News' EU correspondent. Molly covers several courts from her home base in the Netherlands, including the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice.
As citizens of the European Union, we all have rights under EU law. These rights are ultimately interpreted and safeguarded by the Court of Justice of the European Union.
The EU had sort of enshrined this in law actually quite a long time ago. It dates from the 1995 Data Protection Directive, it's called, which was a European Union directive that regulates, the processing of personal data within the European Union.
In 2014, the right to be forgotten hit headlines all over the globe after a man in Spain sought to have links to a newspaper article about him removed from Google search engine results.
Yeah, so the facts behind the case are that in 1998, the Spanish newspaper La Vanguardia published some announcements about the forced sale of properties because of unpaid taxes. I think it was Social Security debts. These properties belonged to a man. His name is Mario Costania Gonzalez. In 2009, this guy asked the newspaper to take these notices down. Basically, he said that if he searched for his own name on Google, the first thing that came up was these forced sale announcements, and that this was bad for business, and he didn't want this information to continue to be public. The newspaper declined. So in 2010, he contacted Google, who also refused to take it down. And then he complained to the Spanish Data Protection Agency, whose acronym in Spanish is AEPD, which is why the case is called Google Spain versus AEPD and Mario Constania Gonzalez. The AEPD rejected the complaint against the newspaper. So they said the newspaper doesn't have to take this down, but they upheld the complaint against Google Spain and Google Incorporated, which was based in the US, and to ask them to remove the links. And Google refused. And so Google appealed the decision to a Spanish court. It wound its way through Spanish court and eventually ended up at the European Court of Justice, which held hearings in, I think, 2013, and then put out their decision in 2014.
The European Union's Court of Justice has ruled in favor of what it calls citizens' right to be forgotten. According to the BBC, the court's ruling requires search engines to remove links in search results upon request if those links are, quote, inadequate or no longer relevant.
It's a bit of an interesting concept. I think it's a bit of a misnomer, actually, because it sort of implies that you can be forgotten, but actually what it often is focusing on is de-indexing. So removing content from search results. This is predominantly Google, especially when you're talking about the European Union, because something like 90% of internet search traffic in the EU runs through Google.
Since 2014, Google has received over 4 million requests to delist search engine results. Around 49% of requests lead to URLs being taken down and unable to be seen by anyone living in the European Union.
From what we understand from Google, mostly people who want stuff taken down, it's kind of two things. It's sort of what you mentioned. It's criminal convictions or sort of bad business practices. So this original case in Spain that had to do with some guy not paying his taxes, this kinds of stuff. People tend to have different feelings about how much you get to be forgotten and how long in the past. I mean, I think that if you're a 18-year-old kid who gets busted for smoking marijuana, I think most people would probably say that when you're 45, that shouldn't be the first thing that comes up on Google. But a lot of other stuff, it's just a very hazy place. But I think both the legislation and the ruling and these data privacy regulators really try to balance the difference between what is public information that we have a right to know and what is private information that's no longer relevant. So you mentioned corrupt politicians, but the ruling does carve out public figures situation. So if you were a corrupt politician, it doesn't seem like you are going to ever be able to request that like your information be taken down because you were a public figure and that has, public interest. But yeah, I mean, where you draw the line between somebody who is just like a big business owner who hasn't paid his taxes versus like a small business owner who had like a bad year kind of thing, I don't know. And I do think it is a discussion that people do have, where the appropriate place is to draw that line.
This ruling was pivotal in the conversation over the right to be forgotten, and it gave legitimacy for privacy advocates to champion this right globally. However, the European Union did not stop there. In 2018, the EU enacted new constraints on technology companies through the General Data Protection Regulation, sometimes referred to as the GDPR.
Essentially, what happened is the EU decided that it was going to kind of update this data protection directive. So it created this thing called the GDPR, which regulates data protection and privacy. There's a lot of components to it. One thing that may be worth noting is the first piece of legislation that sort of had the right to be forgotten, this data protection directive, is a directive, and the GDPR protection regulation is a regulation. So basically what happens is that the European Union passes this sort of set of rules, and then member states have to enshrine them in their laws. And for directives, basically it says that like a country has to like achieve certain goals, but it doesn't really dictate to the countries how they have to like incorporate that. And that's kind of the legislation now that sort of governs the right to be forgotten, because now this current legislation has like sort of taken over from the directive in 1995.
So every time you went onto a website, you would a box would pop up, a dialog box would pop up and ask you, do you allow these cookies or do you not allow these cookies or these to be used? And that's essentially what is the big change for the average person who's on the internet in Europe, is that internet websites have to ask for your consent. And the idea is that it should be as equally easy to make the consent as it is to deny the consent. My name is Kane Burdo. I'm the EU correspondent for Courthouse News Service. I'm based in Sicily, and I cover what's happening in Europe. And occasionally, I also cover the European courts. One of the things I noticed, probably personally I noticed the most, was once the rules came into place, suddenly I was like, I could go and look at news websites in places in America that I used to go look at, of course, because I lived in Louisiana, New Orleans, Louisiana, for 15 years working for the Associated Press. And all of a sudden, as soon as the rules kicked in, various news outlets in Louisiana just decided, I guess, not to try to bother to join the game, the European game. And so the website, you go into WWL TV, the largest broadcaster in the South, basically at least in the Gulf South. And I can't look at their website. Still can't look at their website. And various other websites especially smaller newspapers, can't look at them because they haven't adopted the GDPR rules.
The GDPR had a wide-reaching effect on the internet as a whole. But how did it change the right to be forgotten?
So the process works like you go to Google and you fill out a form, essentially. Google asks you to identify your country of residence, some personal information, the list of URLs you want removed, and in some cases like identification. So like maybe a passport or some sort of, national identity card to say that you are the person that you say they are. I only tell you what Google does because, like I said before, like the overwhelming majority of internet search traffic goes through Google in the EU. So I'm not even totally aware if other internet search companies, presumably they must because it is the rule, but I don't know if they do things any differently. And then basically Google reviews your request, and it sort of weighs your individual right to privacy against the public's right to know, and decides if the URLs that you want like delisted from Google search results are inadequate, irrelevant, or no longer relevant, or excessive in relation to the purposes for which they were processed.
And if Google decides not to, then the individual has the complaint, goes to the Data Protection Authority in his or her country And then the Data Protection Authority then will make its own assessment whether or not the data should be removed or not. And let's just say the Data Authority says, it should remain. There's no reason to take it off. Well, the individual then can go into the legal court system to try to get the data removed. And you can go through all the various levels of appeal. So that's in essence how the system works.
And again, if Google decides to delist specific search results, then the results will be removed, only in the EU. Other people around the world would still be able to find it. While the right to be forgotten Europeans have been living under for several years now is exclusive to them, it has not stopped some nations from pushing to make it a global right.
The French are quite, the French are notoriously quite cheeky. And their data privacy agency is like very aggressive in trying to get Google to kind of implement, or like get tech companies in general to kind of implement much stricter interpretations of like a data privacy. And in 2019, basically they brought this case that essentially the discussion is like, where in the world does Google have to remove these URLs from?
France's Commission for Information Technology and Civil Liberties ordered that Google must delist requested content from global search results. Google refused to comply with the order and was fined $110,000. The case made it up to the European Court of Justice, the same court that ruled in favor of delisting search results in 2014.
They ultimately lost this case before the court, essentially because the judges were like, it's not up to the European Union to dictate what people in other countries get to see, right? That this isn't about, like they don't have the right, the EU doesn't have the right to tell people in the United States or like India what they see on their version of the internet. They can only, sort of regulate what people in the EU see on their version of the internet.
While the conversation over the right to be forgotten is a relatively new one, Europeans' concerns for data and privacy actually date back much further, going as far back as before the fall of the Berlin Wall.
In the EU, a lot of this was kind of kicked off by German reunification in 1989, when East Germany was sort of was reunified with West Germany. It got a lot of EU people, leaders thinking about what to do with data protection, because the Stasi, the Soviet Union secret police, had collected a lot of data on people, and obviously were using this information in like ways that we did not totally, approve of, or we didn't really like. And so I kind of started a discussion within the EU. And then, by 1995, they had like put forth this directive that allowed for this concept of the right to be forgotten.
The interesting thing about Europe is that the regime, or this idea of protecting people's personal private lives more than the American concept, comes out of a history of totalitarianism, of Nazism, of the Nazi regime, of the Stasi police, of Europe's brutal and dark history of dictatorships. So there's a fear in Europe that governments are always spying on you. We do not want to allow anyone, any big government or big company, to get access to my personal information because of this very, very bad history.
As technology continues to evolve and our lives become more increasingly online, nations around the world grapple with providing privacy and the right to know to their citizens. Data protection is an issue that will only become more important, especially as a younger generation is raised in a world that exists on a physical and digital plane.
I do suspect as we go forward, I'm 37, and so a lot of my childhood and teenage years, there was no opportunities to kind of post a lot of stuff online. Whereas, kids these days, it's endless baby photos of my nieces and nephews, and it will just be like this until they are adults. And so I wonder what those kids are going to say when they are 37 about how they feel about, having all of these, their whole photo albums put online. So I'm curious, I guess, to see what sort of happens going forward.
I'm thinking about those spaghetti face baby photos. It's one thing to hang it in your house and another to post it online.